You watch as others effortlessly command respect and get what they want, while you struggle to influence even simple decisions. Every day you see colleagues manipulate situations to their advantage, leaving you wondering why your honest approach fails while their calculated moves succeed. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, and I spent my life studying the dark arts of human psychology and influence in the most treacherous political arena in history, Renaissance Italy. What I discovered about psychological manipulation will transform how you understand and navigate human behavior, giving you the tools to influence outcomes without sacrificing your integrity. The same principles that guided princes and shaped nations can guide you through any situation where persuasion and influence matter. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. Want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the psychology of influence? I was born in 1469 into a Florence that breathed conspiracy with every morning mist rising from the Arno. My father, though of modest means, possessed something far more valuable than gold connections to the intellectual circles that shaped our republic. From my earliest memories, I watched grown men speak in code, their words carrying meanings that lay beneath the surface like hidden currents in a seemingly calm river. When I was barely 7 years old, I witnessed my first lesson in human psychology. A neighbor, Signor Antonio, came to our home seeking my father's counsel about a business dispute. I hid behind the heavy wooden door, listening as this man who had always appeared confident and commanding in public broke down into tears, confessing his fears about financial ruin. What struck me wasn't his vulnerability, but how completely different he became when he thought no one of importance was watching. The mask had slipped, revealing the frightened man beneath the confident exterior. This became my obsession, understanding the difference between who people pretended to be and who they actually were. I began watching everyone, the merchants in the market who smiled while calculating how to overcharge customers, the priests who preached humility while coveting the finest robes, the politicians who spoke of serving the people while enriching themselves. My education at the university exposed me to the classical texts, but it was the living laboratory of Florentine politics that truly taught me about human nature. I learned that every person carried within them competing desires: the desire to be loved and the desire to be feared, the desire to appear virtuous and the desire to gain advantage, the desire to trust and the desire to protect themselves from betrayal. The moment that changed everything came when I was 18. Lorenzo de' Medici had been dead for 2 years, and Florence was fragmenting into factions. I secured a minor position in the Second Chancery, which gave me access to diplomatic correspondence and political meetings. I was nobody, a young clerk whose presence was so unremarkable that powerful men spoke freely in front of me, as if I were invisible furniture. This invisibility became my greatest advantage. I learned to read the micro-expressions that crossed faces when men thought they were unobserved. I noticed how voices changed when speaking to superiors versus subordinates, how posture shifted when confidence wavered, how eyes revealed intentions that words carefully concealed. I discovered that every conversation contained at least 3 levels: what was said, what was meant, and what was truly desired. The most successful people weren't necessarily the most intelligent or virtuous. They were the ones who best understood these hidden layers of human communication. One evening, I watched as Piero Soderini, who would later become Gonfalonier, convinced a hostile faction to support him by speaking to their fears rather than their reason. He never directly addressed their concerns, but instead painted a picture of what would happen if they didn't unite behind strong leadership. He made them feel that supporting him was their own idea, born of their own wisdom and caution. That night, I went home and began writing my first observations about the psychology of persuasion. I realized that most people don't want to be told. what to think they want to feel, that their decisions arise from their own intelligence and judgment. The art then lay in creating conditions where others would naturally arrive at the conclusions you desired. These early years taught me that human psychology follows predictable patterns. People seek safety, status, and satisfaction, and they can be influenced by understanding which of these drives dominates their thinking at any given moment. The key was learning to read these patterns and respond accordingly, not with cruelty or malice, but with strategic understanding of what motivates human behavior. Through years of careful observation in the halls of power, I discovered that human psychology operates according to fundamental laws, as predictable as the movement of celestial bodies. Most people believe they are complex and unpredictable, but I learned that beneath the surface, complexity lies a remarkably consistent pattern of motivations and responses. The first principle I discovered is that every person is driven primarily by self-interest, though they rarely admit this even to themselves. I watched as the most pious citizens made decisions that served their own welfare, while convincing themselves they acted for noble reasons. A merchant would cheat customers while believing he was simply being prudent about his family's future. A politician would break promises while justifying it as necessary for the greater good. This isn't cynicism, it's reality. Once I accepted that self-interest drives most human behavior, I could predict how people would respond to different situations. The key was learning to frame my requests in terms of what served their interests, not mine. When I needed someone's cooperation, I stopped asking them to help me and started showing them how helping me would benefit them. I discovered that people have two fundamental emotional needs that override almost everything else: the need to feel safe and the need to feel important. Every decision, every response, every choice can be traced back to one of these core drives. Understanding this gave me incredible insight into human behavior. Fear, I learned, is more reliable than love as a motivator. Love is fickle, it changes with circumstances, mood, and competing loyalties. But fear is constant. People will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid what they fear, and they will consistently choose options that promise security over those that offer mere pleasure or gain. However, fear must be balanced carefully. Too much fear creates desperation, which makes people unpredictable and dangerous. Too little fear breeds complacency and disrespect. The art lies in maintaining just enough concern to ensure attention and compliance without triggering panic or rebellion. I observed that people's stated values often conflict with their revealed preferences. They claim to value honesty but reward those who tell them what they want to hear. They say they want fair treatment but actually prefer being given advantages over others. They profess to admire humility while being drawn to confidence and authority. This contradiction taught me to watch what people do, not what they say. Their actions reveal their true motivations, while their words reveal only what they want to believe about themselves, or what they think others want to hear. Another crucial discovery was that people make decisions emotionally and then justify them rationally. I witnessed countless meetings where someone would oppose a proposal for personal reasons. Perhaps it threatened their position or contradicted their previous stance, but they would present logical arguments against it. They weren't consciously lying, they genuinely believed their rational objections were their real motivation. This insight revolutionized how I approached persuasion. Instead of leading with logical arguments, I learned to address the emotional concerns first. Once someone felt emotionally comfortable with an idea, they would find logical reasons to support it. But no amount of logic could overcome emotional resistance. I discovered that people desperately want to feel that their opinions matter, and that they have some control over their circumstances. The most effective way to influence someone wasn't to impose my will upon them, but to guide them toward reaching my desired conclusion while feeling that they had arrived there through their own wisdom and judgment. This required patience and subtlety, Instead of telling someone what to think, I would ask questions that led them to think about the right things. Instead of presenting solutions, I would describe problems in ways that made my preferred solution seem obvious. Instead of making demands, I would create situations where others would naturally want to do what I needed them to do. The final principle I learned was that people are remarkably willing to deceive themselves when the truth is uncomfortable. They will ignore obvious evidence, rationalize contradictory behavior, and believe convenient lies rather than face difficult realities. This self-deception isn't weakness, it's a psychological defense mechanism that allows people to function despite life's inherent uncertainties and moral complexities. Understanding this tendency toward self-deception became one of my most powerful tools. I could influence people by helping them construct narratives that justified doing what I wanted, while preserving their self-image as good, rational individuals. Let me be clear about something that makes many people uncomfortable. Deception is not inherently evil. It is a tool, like a knife, which can be used to harm or to heal, to destroy or to protect. In my years navigating the treacherous waters of Renaissance politics, I learned that the question isn't whether to use deception, but when and how to use it ethically and effectively. The first distinction I made was between malicious lies intended to harm others and strategic misdirection intended to protect legitimate interests. When Cesare Borgia was advancing toward Florence with his armies, I couldn't simply tell him our true military weakness that would have invited invasion and brought suffering to thousands of innocent citizens. Instead, I had to create the impression that Florence was better defended than it actually was, buying time for us to strengthen our position. This wasn't malicious deception. It was strategic communication designed to prevent conflict. The art lay in presenting information in ways that led others to draw conclusions favorable to my objectives while never stating anything explicitly false. I learned to master the space between truth and lies, the realm of implication, emphasis, and selective revelation. One of my most powerful discoveries was that people believe what they want to believe, and they will often convince themselves of things you never explicitly claimed. During negotiations, I would present facts that could be interpreted multiple ways, allowing the other party to construct interpretations that served their psychological needs while serving my practical objectives. For example, when discussing military alliances, I might mention our recent improvements to city fortifications and our increased recruitment of mercenaries. I never claimed these forces were larger or more capable than they actually were, but I presented the information in contexts that suggested strength and preparedness. The listeners, wanting to believe they were dealing with a formidable ally rather than a vulnerable city-state, would often exaggerate our capabilities in their own minds. The psychology behind this is fascinating. People prefer certainty to uncertainty, hope to despair, and favorable interpretations to unfavorable ones. When you provide information that can be interpreted optimistically or pessimistically, most people will choose the interpretation that makes them feel better about their situation. Your role becomes guiding them toward interpretations that happen to align with your objectives. I discovered that timing dramatically affects how information is received and interpreted. The same facts presented at different moments can create completely different impressions. When someone is anxious or under pressure, they are more likely to accept explanations that promise relief or resolution. When someone is confident and relaxed, they may scrutinize the same information much more carefully. This taught me to orchestrate conversations and negotiations like musical compositions, paying attention to rhythm, tension, and release. I would sometimes create mild anxiety about a problem before presenting my preferred solution, making that solution seem more attractive than it would have appeared otherwise. Another crucial insight was that most people want to feel intelligent and perceptive. They take pride in reading between the lines and understanding implications. I learned to communicate important information through subtle hints and implications, rather than direct statements. This made people feel clever for understanding my meaning, and it created a sense of conspiracy or special knowledge that bonded them to me. The most sophisticated form of strategic deception I developed was what I call truthful misdirection. This involves presenting completely accurate information while guiding attention towards certain aspects and away from others. Like a magician, who shows you exactly what he's doing while directing your attention to the wrong hand. You can influence perceptions dramatically without ever lying. I practiced this during diplomatic missions by emphasizing Florence's cultural achievements and trade relationships when I wanted to project soft power, or highlighting our strategic location and defensive capabilities when I wanted to suggest military significance. Every fact I presented was true, but the selection and emphasis created the overall impression I desired. The key to ethical deception is maintaining clear boundaries about your ultimate objectives. I used these techniques to protect Florence, prevent unnecessary conflicts, and create mutually beneficial outcomes. I never used them to exploit innocent people or to gain advantages that would harm others unjustly. I learned that the most effective deception often involves revealing selective truths rather than constructing elaborate falsehoods. People are surprisingly good at detecting outright lies, but they struggle to recognize when they're receiving an incomplete picture. By controlling what information they have access to and how that information is presented, you can influence their conclusions without compromising your integrity. The final lesson in strategic deception is that it must be sustainable. Elaborate lies eventually collapse under their own weight, but strategic presentation of truthful information can be maintained indefinitely. The goal isn't to fool people permanently, but to guide them toward decisions that serve everyone's interests during the time when those decisions must be made. One of the most misunderstood principles I ever wrote about is the relationship between fear and love in human psychology. People often quote me as saying it is better to be feared than loved, but they miss the crucial subtlety. It is best to be both feared and loved, but if you must choose, fear is more reliable than love. Let me explain what I really discovered. Through years of observing how people respond to different types of authority, love is conditional and fragile. People love you when you make them happy, when you serve their interests, when you meet their expectations. But love evaporates quickly when circumstances change. I watched many leaders fall from grace the moment they could no longer provide what their followers wanted. Fear, however, is based on consequences that remain constant, regardless of emotional fluctuations. When someone knows that certain actions will lead to predictable negative outcomes, they modify their behavior accordingly. This isn't about terrorizing people, it's about establishing clear boundaries and consistent accountability. The key insight is understanding what type of fear to cultivate. Healthy fear is respect for your competence, your standards, and your ability to enforce consequences. Unhealthy fear is terror of your unpredictability, cruelty, or vindictiveness. The first creates stability and cooperation. The second creates desperation and eventual rebellion. During my time serving the Florentine government, I observed Cesare Borgia masterfully demonstrate this principle. His enemies feared him not because he was randomly violent, but because he was predictably decisive. When he said something would happen, it happened. When he established a rule, it was enforced. People could trust his word even when they couldn't trust his intentions, and this reliability created a strange form of security in an otherwise chaotic political environment. I learned to distinguish between fear that motivates and fear that paralyzes. When people fear disappointing you because they respect your judgment and want to maintain their relationship with you, they become more careful, more thoughtful, more committed to excellence. When people fear you because they believe you're dangerous or unstable, they become defensive, secretive, and focused on self-preservation rather than performance. The art lies in projecting strength without projecting threat. I discovered that people need to believe you have the power to affect their circumstances significantly, but they also need to trust that you'll use that power fairly and predictably. This requires demonstrating competence, maintaining consistent standards, and following through on both promises and warnings. In my diplomatic work, I cultivated this balanced fear by being impeccably prepared for every meeting and negotiation. Other diplomats learned that I would know details they had overlooked, anticipate arguments they thought were clever, and remember commitments they hoped I would forget. They feared looking foolish or unprepared in my presence, which motivated them to take our interactions seriously. I also learned the importance of controlled demonstrations of capability. Occasionally, you must show that your potential consequences are real, not just theoretical. But these demonstrations must be proportional, justified, and rare. If you have to use your power frequently, you're not wielding it effectively. The most powerful people I observed rarely had to prove their strength because everyone already understood it. Respect, I discovered, comes from consistently displaying competence, fairness, and reliability. People respect those who can solve problems they cannot solve, who maintain their principles under pressure, and who treat others according to consistent standards rather than personal whims. Respect is earned through demonstrated value, not through position or title. The most effective leaders I observed commanded both fear and respect by setting high standards and helping people meet them. They were feared because disappointment carried consequences, but respected because they provided the guidance, resources, and support necessary for success. People knew that failure would be addressed, but they also knew that effort would be recognized and competence would be rewarded. I learned that fear without respect creates compliance without commitment. People will do the minimum necessary to avoid consequences, but they won't go beyond requirements or take initiative. Respect without fear creates admiration without accountability. People will like and praise you, but they may not prioritize your objectives when they conflict with their convenience. The combination of healthy fear and genuine respect creates something powerful: willing cooperation. People want to perform well for you because they value your approval and want to avoid your disappointment. They take your objectives seriously because they understand the consequences of failure, but they also trust that those consequences will be fair and proportional. In modern contexts, this translates to establishing clear expectations, consistent accountability, and demonstrated competence. People should understand what success and failure look like in their relationship with you, and they should believe that you have both the ability and the commitment to respond appropriately to both. The final insight about fear and respect is that both must be earned repeatedly. You cannot coast on past demonstrations of competence or previous enforcement of consequences. People constantly test boundaries and reassess capabilities. Maintaining the right balance requires ongoing attention to how your actions affect others' perceptions of your reliability, fairness, and strength. In the courts of Renaissance Italy, I learned that silence could be more powerful than the most eloquent speech. Most people fear silence and rush to fill it with words, but I discovered that strategic silence creates psychological pressure that can be far more persuasive than any argument. The first time I understood this principle was during a tense negotiation with representatives from the Papal States. They had presented demands that were completely unreasonable, expecting immediate responses and emotional reactions. Instead of engaging with their arguments or expressing outrage, I simply sat quietly, maintaining eye contact, letting their words hang in the air. The silence became unbearable for them. Within minutes, they began modifying their position, offering explanations, seeking some kind of response from me. By saying nothing, I had communicated volumes about the weakness of their position and the strength of mine. They convinced themselves that I held information or advantages they didn't understand, simply because I wasn't rushing to defend or explain. I learned that silence forces others to project their own thoughts, fears, and assumptions into the void. When you don't respond immediately, people begin wondering what you're thinking, what you know, what you're planning. This uncertainty creates anxiety, and anxiety motivates people to fill in the blanks with scenarios that are often more dramatic than reality. The psychology behind this is fascinating. Humans are social creatures who rely on constant feedback and validation in their interactions. When that feedback is withheld, they experience psychological discomfort that compels them to seek resolution. They will often provide more information, make concessions, or reveal their true motivations simply to break the uncomfortable silence. I discovered that there are several types of strategic silence, each serving different purposes. Contemplative silence suggests that you're carefully considering what has been said, which makes others feel heard while buying you time to formulate your response. This type of silence shows respect for the speaker, while demonstrating that you take the conversation seriously. Skeptical silence, on the other hand, communicates doubt without direct confrontation. When someone makes a claim or proposal, a pause, accompanied by a slight frown or raised eyebrow, can express skepticism more effectively than verbal challenges. The speaker will often begin defending or clarifying their position without being asked. Authoritative silence projects confidence and control. This is the silence of someone who doesn't feel compelled to justify their position or convince others of their worth. It suggests that you're comfortable with yourself and your circumstances, which paradoxically makes others more interested in gaining your approval or understanding your perspective. I also learned about the power of delayed responses in written correspondence. When someone sends an urgent request or emotional letter, the immediate impulse is to respond quickly to show attentiveness or concern. But I discovered that strategic delays could significantly shift the psychological dynamics of the relationship. A delayed response suggests that you have other important matters requiring your attention, which elevates your perceived status and value. It also allows emotions to cool and gives the other party time to reconsider their position. Often, by the time I responded to an urgent request, the sender had already begun moving toward a more reasonable position. The timing of your eventual response becomes crucial. Too short a delay has no psychological impact. Too long a delay can be interpreted as rudeness or indifference. The optimal delay varies depending on the relationship, the urgency of the matter, and the emotional state of the other person. I learned to use silence to manage the pace and rhythm of conversations. By introducing pauses at strategic moments, I could emphasize important points, create suspense, or shift the energy in the room. A pause before answering a question suggests that the question deserves careful consideration. A pause after making a statement allows it to sink in and demonstrate confidence in its truth. One of the most powerful applications of strategic silence is in response to emotional outbursts or aggressive behavior. When someone is angry or confrontational, their expectation is that you will respond emotionally, either with matching aggression or defensive explanations. By remaining silent and calm, you force them to either escalate to an obviously unreasonable level or begin moderating their tone. This technique works because silence doesn't provide the emotional fuel that feeds conflict. Anger requires engagement to sustain itself. When you don't provide that engagement, the angry person quickly realizes they are performing for an unresponsive audience, which makes them feel foolish and motivates them to regain composure. I also discovered that selective silence could be used to direct attention and emphasize key points. In group discussions, I would participate actively in some parts of the conversation while remaining conspicuously quiet during others. This pattern trained people to pay special attention when I did speak, knowing that my contributions were deliberate rather than automatic. The key to using silence effectively is maintaining confident body language and facial expressions. Silence, accompanied by nervous fidgeting or uncertain expressions, communicates discomfort rather than strength. But silence combined with steady eye contact, relaxed posture, and calm breathing projects authority and subservience. Mastering strategic silence requires overcoming the natural human impulse to explain, justify, and convince. Most people are uncomfortable with ambiguity and silence, so they fill gaps with unnecessary words that often weaken their position. Learning when not to speak is often more valuable than learning what to say. In the elaborate theater of Renaissance diplomacy, I learned that the most important conversations happened without words. While men crafted careful speeches and diplomatic phrases, their bodies told the truth about their intentions, fears, and desires. Mastering this unspoken language became one of my greatest advantages in understanding and influencing human behavior. My education in reading people began with studying the merchants in Florence's markets. I noticed that successful traders watched their customers' faces and posture as much as they listened to their words. A customer might claim to be merely browsing, but their eyes lingering on a particular item, their subtle lean forward, or the way they unconsciously touched their purse revealed their true interest in purchasing power. I began keeping detailed notes on the physical behaviors I observed during important meetings. I documented how people's posture changed when they felt confident versus uncertain, how their facial expressions shifted when they were concealing information, and how their gestures revealed emotions they were trying to suppress. The first crucial insight was understanding baseline behavior. Everyone has natural patterns of movement, expression, and positioning when they feel comfortable and relaxed. Deviations from this baseline often indicate internal tension, deception, or strong emotion. A normally animated person becoming still might be concentrating on controlling their reactions. A typically reserved person making excessive gestures might be overcompensating for nervousness. I learned to identify the physical signs of deception, though I discovered these were more subtle than most people imagine. Liars don't necessarily avoid eye contact or fidget, obviously. Instead, they often overcompensate by maintaining uncomfortably intense eye contact or sitting unnaturally still. The key was looking for behaviors that seemed forced or inconsistent with the person's normal patterns. Micro-expressions fascinated me most of all. These brief flashes of genuine emotion appear on people's faces before they can consciously control them. A moment of anger flickering across someone's features before they compose themselves into a diplomatic smile. A flash of fear in their eyes before they project confidence. A brief expression of contempt before they offer false agreement. Learning to catch these micro-expressions required intense focus and practice. But the information they provided was invaluable. They revealed people's genuine reactions to proposals, their true feelings about other individuals, and their honest assessment of situations, regardless of what they said aloud. I discovered that people's positioning in a room tells a story about power dynamics and relationships. Who sits where, who stands near whom, who maintains distance from whom. These spatial relationships reveal alliances, tensions, and hierarchies that formal introductions never acknowledge. The person who subtly positions themselves between two potential adversaries is often the mediator or power broker. The individual who maintains distance from the group while still participating is usually the observer or outsider. Hand gestures provided another rich source of information. Clenched fists revealed suppressed anger or determination. Open palms suggested honesty or submission. Hands touching the face often indicated doubt or deception. Fingers drumming or tapping revealed impatience or anxiety. Steepled fingers projected authority and confidence. I learned to read the subtle signs of agreement and resistance long before people voiced their positions. Nodding that begins before someone finishes. Speaking indicates genuine agreement or eagerness. Slight backward leans suggest skepticism or disagreement. Arms crossing over the chest creates a physical barrier that often reflects emotional resistance. Voice patterns proved equally revealing. Changes in pitch, pace, and volume often conveyed more than the actual words being spoken. A slight rise in pitch might indicate stress or deception. Slower speech could suggest careful consideration or uncertainty. Louder volume might mask insecurity or attempt to dominate through force rather than logic. The positioning of feet became one of my most reliable indicators of true interest and intention. People's feet naturally point toward what they're most interested in or where they want to go. In group conversations, foot positioning reveals who has the most influence or who someone really wants to talk to, regardless of where they're looking or who they're addressing verbally. I developed techniques for reading group dynamics by observing interaction patterns. Who speaks first often reveals the real leader, regardless of formal titles. Who others look to for confirmation shows where true authority lies. Who remains silent during certain topics might have the most at stake in those areas. Understanding these unspoken communications allowed me to position myself advantageously in any social situation. If I could see that someone was genuinely interested despite their verbal reservations, I knew to continue persuading. If I observed that someone was becoming genuinely angry despite their calm words, I knew to shift strategies before they exploded. I also learned to control my own body language to project desired impressions. Maintaining steady eye contact projected confidence and honesty. Open posture suggested receptiveness and trustworthiness. Controlled gestures conveyed authority and composure. Matching others' energy levels created rapport and comfort. The most sophisticated application of this knowledge was using body language to influence others' emotional states. By projecting calm confidence, I could help de-escalate tense situations. By displaying appropriate concern, I could validate others' worries while guiding them toward solutions. By showing genuine interest through my posture and attention, I could make people feel heard and valued. Reading the unspoken language requires constant practice and careful observation, but it provides information that can transform your effectiveness in any human interaction. People reveal their true thoughts and feelings through hundreds of unconscious signals, and learning to interpret these signals gives you insights that others miss entirely. During my years in the halls of power, I witnessed something that fundamentally changed my understanding of human psychology. People will submit to authority even when that authority has no real power to compel them. The mere perception of authority triggers automatic compliance in most individuals, regardless of whether that authority is legitimate, beneficial, or even rational. This revelation came to me while observing how people interacted with Cesare Borgia. Even when he had no soldiers present and no immediate ability to enforce his will, diplomats and nobles would defer to him, speak carefully around him, and seek his approval. They responded not to his actual power in those moments, but to their mental concept of his authority. The crown, the title, the reputation, these symbols carried more immediate influence than armies. I began studying what creates the perception of authority and discovered it operates on multiple psychological levels. The first is visual, how someone looks, dresses, and carries themselves. I noticed that people dressed in fine clothing received more deference than those in simple garments, regardless of their actual wealth or position. Height, posture, and confident movement all contributed to an aura of authority that others instinctively recognized and responded to. The second level is social proof, what others believe about someone's authority. If important people treat someone with respect and deference, others automatically assume that person deserves such treatment. I watched minor functionaries gain significant influence simply because a few respected individuals publicly acknowledged their expertise or position. The third level is competence, demonstrated ability to achieve results or provide valuable insights. People naturally defer to those who consistently solve problems, make accurate predictions, or possess knowledge they lack. This type of authority is earned rather than assumed, but it's also the most sustainable and respected form. I learned to project authority through careful attention to all these elements. I studied how successful leaders dressed, spoke, and positioned themselves. I observed which behaviors commanded attention and respect versus those that undermined credibility. I practiced controlling my voice, posture, and gestures to communicate confidence and competence. Voice proved to be one of the most powerful tools for projecting authority. Speaking slightly slower than normal suggests careful thought and confidence in your words. Lowering your voice forces others to pay closer attention while conveying seriousness and control. Avoiding statements with rising intonation, as if asking a question, prevents your declarations from sounding uncertain or seeking approval. I discovered that people respond to credentials and titles even when they know little about what those credentials actually represent. A person introduced as doctor or professor receives automatic respect and attention that the same person without titles would not command. This taught me the importance of establishing and communicating my expertise clearly in any new situation. Physical positioning also affects perceived authority dramatically. Standing while others sit, occupying the head of a table, or taking a central position in a room all signal leadership and command attention. I learned to arrive early to meetings so I could choose advantageous seating and to move purposefully, rather than drifting aimlessly, which projects direction and confidence. The psychology of scarcity enhances authority significantly. When your time, attention, or approval seems limited and valuable, people naturally assume you must be important. I practiced strategic unavailability, not being instantly accessible to everyone, requiring appointments for substantial conversations, and occasionally declining meetings or invitations to maintain the impression that my time was highly valued. I observed that people want to believe in authority because it provides psychological comfort. Following established authority figures relieves individuals of the burden of making difficult decisions and reduces their anxiety about uncertain outcomes. When you project competent authority, you're offering people relief from the stress of responsibility and uncertainty. However, I learned that authority must be balanced with approachability. Pure authority without warmth can create fear and resentment. The most effective leaders I observed combined clear authority with genuine concern for others' welfare. They were simultaneously respected and liked, feared and trusted. The use of silence and measured responses greatly enhances perceived authority. Rushing to answer questions or immediately responding to challenges can make you seem defensive or insecure. Taking time to consider responses, asking clarifying questions, and speaking only when you have something valuable to contribute all reinforce the impression that your words carry weight and deserve attention. I discovered that consistent standards and follow-through are essential for maintaining authority. People test leaders constantly to see if rules and expectations are real or merely suggestions. When you establish standards and then fail to enforce them consistently, your authority erodes rapidly. But when people see that your words reliably predict outcomes, they begin treating your statements with appropriate seriousness. The most sophisticated aspect of authority I learned was how to delegate it effectively. True authority isn't diminished by sharing it with competent subordinates, it's multiplied. When you elevate others and publicly acknowledge their expertise in their areas of strength, you demonstrate confidence in your own position while creating loyalty and expanding your influence through them. Understanding the psychology of authority also revealed its limitations. Authority based solely on position or appearance is fragile and temporary. People eventually test it, and if it lacks substance, it collapses. Sustainable authority must be built on genuine competence, consistent character, and real value provided to others. The final insight about authority is that it must be renewed constantly through actions that justify others. Confidence in your leadership, past achievements, create initial authority, but ongoing performance maintains it. People want to follow leaders who continue growing, learning, and delivering results, rather than those who coast on previous successes. In modern contexts, these principles translate directly. Whether you're leading a team, presenting ideas, or seeking to influence outcomes, your perceived authority will significantly impact your effectiveness. By understanding and applying these psychological principles ethically, you can command the attention and respect necessary to create positive change. The term emotional manipulation carries negative connotations in modern discourse, but I discovered that understanding and influencing emotions is simply part of effective human communication. Every interaction involves emotional elements, and choosing to ignore this reality doesn't make you more ethical. It simply makes you less effective and often less helpful to others. My understanding of emotional influence began with a simple observation. People make decisions based on how they feel, then use logic to justify those decisions. I watched countless negotiations where the outcome was determined not by the strongest arguments, but by which party better understood and addressed the emotional concerns of the decision makers. The key distinction I learned was between manipulation that serves your interests at others' expense versus influence that creates mutual benefit. Ethical emotional influence involves understanding what people need to feel in order to make decisions that serve everyone's interests, then helping them experience those emotions authentically. During my diplomatic missions, I often encountered resistance that had nothing to do with the substance of my proposals. Officials would reject beneficial agreements because accepting them would make them feel subordinate, foolish, or disloyal to previous positions. My job became helping them find ways to say yes while preserving their dignity and self-image. I learned that people have fundamental emotional needs that must be addressed before they can engage productively with logical arguments. They need to feel heard, respected, and valued. They need to believe their concerns are understood and their perspectives acknowledged. They need to feel that they have some control over the situation and that their autonomy is respected. One of my most effective techniques was what I called emotional validation, followed by gentle redirection. When someone expressed concerns or objections, I would first acknowledge the legitimacy of their feelings and the intelligence behind their thinking. This validation satisfied their need to be heard and respected. Only after they felt understood would I introduce new perspectives or alternative approaches. For example, when a Florentine official resisted a proposed alliance because it seemed to favor our potential partners, I didn't immediately argue about the benefits to Florence. Instead, I said, "Your caution shows wisdom. Any agreement that doesn't serve Florence's interests would be a betrayal of your responsibilities to our citizens." This validated his identity as a protector of Florentine interests, making him feel appreciated rather than challenged. Once he felt respected for his caution, I could then explore how the alliance might actually serve his core objective of protecting Florence, reframing the agreement as fulfilling rather than compromising his duties. The same facts that initially seemed threatening now appeared beneficial because his emotional needs had been addressed. I discovered that people desperately want to feel intelligent and perceptive. When you help someone reach your desired conclusion through their own reasoning process, they experience satisfaction and ownership that makes them much more committed to the outcome. This requires patience and skill in asking the right questions and providing the right information at the right time. The psychology behind this is that people resist conclusions imposed upon them, even when those conclusions are correct and beneficial. But they embrace conclusions they feel they've reached, independently, even when they've been guided toward them. The art lies in the guidance being so subtle that it feels like natural discovery. I learned to recognize and work with basic emotional states that affect decision-making. When people are anxious, they prefer options that promise security and stability. When they're confident, they're more willing to consider bold or innovative approaches. When they feel pressured, they often make poor decisions or become stubborn and resistant. When they feel supported, they're more open to new ideas and willing to take reasonable risks. Understanding these emotional patterns allowed me to time my requests and proposals appropriately. I would wait for moments when people were in emotional states conducive to the decisions I hoped they would make, or I would help create those emotional states through the way I presented information and framed situations. One powerful technique I developed was helping people feel proud of decisions that served my objectives. Instead of asking them to do something for me, I would frame requests in terms of their values, capabilities, and noble objectives. A request for military support became an opportunity for them to demonstrate courage and loyalty. A commercial agreement became a chance for them to show wisdom and foresight. I also learned the importance of managing my own emotional state to influence others effectively. When I remained calm during tense situations, others often mirrored that calmness. When I projected confidence during uncertain times, others found reasons to feel more optimistic. When I showed appropriate concern without panic, others felt that their worries were acknowledged without feeling overwhelmed. The most sophisticated application of emotional influence I mastered was creating positive emotional associations with ideas, people, or proposals I wanted others to support. This involved presenting those things in contexts that naturally generated good feelings during pleasant meals, in beautiful settings, after successful collaborations, or following moments of mutual laughter and connection. The ethical foundation for all of this was ensuring that the emotions I influenced were genuine and that the outcomes served legitimate interests. I never tried to make people feel things that weren't based in reality, and I never used emotional influence to convince people to act against their own best interests. The goal was always to help people feel appropriately about situations that would benefit everyone involved. Understanding emotional influence also taught me to recognize when others were attempting to manipulate me. I became aware of how my own emotional states affected my judgment and decision-making, which helped me maintain objectivity during important negotiations and conversations. The key to ethical emotional influence is transparency about your objectives and genuine concern for others' welfare. When people understand what you're trying to achieve and trust that you care about their interests as well as your own, they often welcome your guidance in managing the emotional aspects of difficult decisions. In my years navigating the complex web of Renaissance politics, I discovered one of the most powerful and reliable principles of human psychology: the compulsion to reciprocate. People feel psychologically uncomfortable when they owe someone a favor, and they will go to extraordinary lengths to restore balance in their relationships. Understanding this principle transformed how I approached diplomacy and influence. The foundation of reciprocity lies in a fundamental human need for fairness and balance. When someone does something beneficial for us, we experience what I learned to recognize as psychological debt. This debt creates internal pressure that can only be relieved by returning the favor, often with interest. The person who understands how to create and manage this psychological debt holds tremendous influence. My first lesson in strategic reciprocity came during negotiations with the Venetian Republic. Instead of immediately presenting our requests, I began by offering information that would be valuable to their merchant's details, about new trade routes and market conditions that our Florentine contacts had discovered. This information cost me nothing but established me as someone who provided value before seeking it. When I later presented Florence's proposals, the Venetian negotiators approached them with a fundamentally different attitude. Instead of viewing me as someone trying to extract concessions from them, they saw me as someone who had already demonstrated good faith and mutual benefit. They felt obligated to reciprocate my earlier generosity, which made them more receptive to finding ways to accommodate our needs. I learned that the timing and magnitude of reciprocal exchanges are crucial to their effectiveness. Small favors done consistently over time often create stronger obligations than large gestures made once. A pattern of helpful actions establishes you as someone who contributes value to the relationship, making others want to maintain that relationship by reciprocating appropriately. The psychology behind this is fascinating. When someone helps us repeatedly in small ways, we begin to see them as an ally whose success serves our interests. We want them to continue being helpful, so we look for opportunities to support them in return. This creates an upward spiral of mutual benefit that strengthens over time. I discovered that the most powerful reciprocal favors are those that cost you little but provide significant value to the recipient. Information, introductions, and small conveniences often generate more gratitude than expensive gifts, because they demonstrate thoughtfulness and understanding of what the other person actually needs. During my time in the Florentine government, I made it a practice to remember details about people's personal interests, challenges, and goals. When I encountered information or opportunities that might help them, I would share these resources freely. A merchant struggling with transportation might receive tips about reliable cart services. An official worried about his son's education might learn about excellent tutors. A diplomat facing a difficult negotiation might get insights about his counterpart's motivations. These small acts of helpfulness cost me almost nothing but created networks of people who felt positively toward me and wanted to be helpful in return. When I needed information, support, or cooperation, I had built relationships with individuals who were psychologically motivated to assist me. I also learned the importance of making reciprocity feel natural rather than calculated. When people sense that your helpfulness is purely strategic, it reduces their feeling of obligation and may even create resentment. The most effective reciprocity appears to arise from genuine interest in others' welfare and spontaneous generosity rather than obvious quid pro quo exchanges. The key to authentic reciprocity is developing genuine curiosity about others' needs and challenges. When you pay attention to what people are struggling with or hoping to achieve, opportunities to be helpful present themselves naturally. Your assistance feels thoughtful and personal rather than mechanical or manipulative. I discovered that asking people for small favors can actually strengthen relationships rather than weakening them. When someone does something helpful for you, they often become more invested in your success because they want their effort to have been worthwhile. This psychological phenomenon means that receiving help can create loyalty just as much as providing it. The most sophisticated application of reciprocity involves creating win-win situations where helping you also serves the other person's interests. Instead of asking people to sacrifice for your benefit, you present opportunities where supporting your objectives also advances their own goals. This alignment makes reciprocity feel natural and sustainable rather than burdensome. I learned to track the reciprocal balance in important relationships carefully. When someone had done significant favors for me, I would look for appropriate ways to return value before asking for additional help. When others owed me favors, I would time my requests strategically to maximize their effectiveness, while maintaining the relationship's positive dynamic. The ethical foundation of reciprocity requires ensuring that the exchanges are genuinely beneficial to all parties involved. Using reciprocity to convince people to act against their own interests is manipulative and ultimately but helping people achieve their legitimate objectives, while also advancing your own, creates sustainable relationships built on mutual benefit. Understanding reciprocity also taught me to recognize when others were attempting to create artificial obligations. Some people offer unsolicited favors specifically to generate psychological debt they can later exploit. Being aware of these tactics allows you to appreciate genuine helpfulness while maintaining appropriate boundaries with those who use generosity as a manipulation tool. The most powerful aspect of reciprocity is that it creates positive cycles of mutual support. When you consistently provide value to others before seeking benefits for yourself, you build a reputation as someone worth supporting. People begin looking for ways to help you because they know you'll appreciate their assistance and find ways to reciprocate appropriately. In modern contexts, these principles translate directly to professional and personal relationships. Whether you're building a career, developing partnerships, or creating community connections, understanding and applying reciprocity ethically can dramatically enhance your ability to achieve positive outcomes for everyone involved. One of the most powerful and disturbing discoveries I made about human psychology was how easily people abandon their individual judgment when they believe everyone else thinks differently. I witnessed intelligent, capable individuals make decisions they would never make alone simply because they perceived those decisions as having social approval or momentum. This phenomenon first became clear to me during the rise and fall of Girolamo Savonarola in Florence. I watched as citizens who had previously shown independent thought and reasonable judgment became swept up in collective hysteria. They burned books they had cherished, destroyed art they had admired, and denounced neighbors they had respected, all because the crowd around them was doing the same. What fascinated me wasn't that people were persuaded by Savonarola's arguments, but that they seemed to stop thinking critically altogether once they perceived themselves as part of a movement. Individual minds merged into a collective consciousness that operated according to different psychological rules than personal reflection and reasoning. I began studying how this group psychology could be understood and, when necessary, influenced. I discovered that people constantly look to others for cues about how to think, feel, and behave, especially in uncertain or ambiguous situations. When someone doesn't know what the correct response should be, they observe what others are doing and assume that must be appropriate. This creates opportunities for tremendous influence if you can control or shape the perception of what everyone else is thinking or doing. During diplomatic negotiations, I learned to reference the opinions and actions of respected third parties to support my positions. Instead of arguing that Florence should take a particular action, I would mention that similar cities had found such actions beneficial, or that wise leaders generally favored such approaches. The psychology behind social proof operates on multiple levels. At the most basic level, people assume that if many others are doing something, it must be safe or beneficial. This saves mental energy by avoiding the need to analyze every decision independently. At a deeper level, people want to belong to groups and fear being excluded or criticized for having unpopular opinions. I discovered that the perceived consensus matters more than actual consensus. If people believe that most others support a particular idea or action, they will often support it themselves, even if the actual majority feels differently. This means that creating the impression of widespread support can be more important than building actual widespread support. During my time in government, I learned to identify and cultivate opinion leaders, individuals whose views others naturally follow. These weren't always the people with official authority, but rather those whom others looked to for guidance about what to think or how to respond. By influencing these key individuals, I could indirectly influence much larger groups. The most effective opinion leaders were those who seemed independent and thoughtful rather than obviously partisan. When someone who appeared to be forming their opinions through careful analysis reached conclusions that supported my objectives, their endorsement carried far more weight than advocacy from known allies. I also learned to use social proof through strategic storytelling. Instead of making direct arguments, I would share examples of other people or communities that had faced similar challenges and found success through the approaches I recommended. These stories provided social proof without appearing to be persuasion attempts. The power of social proof increases dramatically during times of uncertainty or crisis. When people feel confused or threatened, they become much more likely to look to others for guidance about how to respond. I observed that during political upheavals or military threats, individual judgment often disappeared entirely as people desperately sought the security of following the crowd. Understanding this dynamic allowed me to provide calm, confident leadership during chaotic times when others were looking around frantically for cues about how to respond. I could project certainty and direction that others would naturally follow. By remaining composed and decisive when others felt lost, I became an anchor point that helped stabilize group psychology. I learned that social proof could be manufactured through careful orchestration of visible support. Having a few respected individuals publicly endorse an idea or action often triggered broader acceptance, as others assumed the initial supporters must know. The psychology behind social proof operates on multiple levels. At the most basic level, people assume that if many others are doing something, it must be safe or beneficial. This saves mental energy by avoiding the need to analyze every decision independently. At a deeper level, people want to belong to groups and fear being excluded or criticized for having unpopular opinions. I discovered that the perceived consensus matters more than actual consensus. If people believe that most others support a particular idea or action, they will often support it themselves, even if the actual majority feels differently. This means that creating the impression of widespread support can be more important than building actual widespread support. During my time in government, I learned to identify and cultivate opinion leaders, individuals whose views others naturally follow. These weren't always the people with official authority, but rather those whom others looked to for guidance about what to think or how to respond. By influencing these key individuals, I could indirectly influence much larger groups. The most effective opinion leaders were those who seemed independent and thoughtful rather than obviously partisan. When someone who appeared to be forming their opinions through careful analysis reached conclusions that supported my objectives, their endorsement carried far more weight than advocacy from known allies. I also learned to use social proof through strategic storytelling. Instead of making direct arguments, I would share examples of other people or communities that had faced similar challenges and found success through the approaches I recommended. These stories provided social proof without appearing to be persuasion attempts. The power of social proof increases dramatically during times of uncertainty or crisis. When people feel confused or threatened, they become much more likely to look to others for guidance about how to respond. I observed that during political upheavals or military threats, individual judgment often disappeared entirely as people desperately sought the security of following the crowd. Understanding this dynamic allowed me to provide calm, confident leadership during chaotic times, when others were looking around frantically for cues about how to respond. I could project certainty and direction that others would naturally follow. By remaining composed and decisive when others felt lost, I became an anchor point that helped stabilize group psychology. I learned that social proof could be manufactured through careful orchestration of visible support. Having a few respected individuals publicly endorse an idea or action often triggered broader acceptance, as others assumed the initial supporters must know something they didn't. The key was ensuring that the initial supporters appeared to be acting independently rather than following instructions. The ethical dimension of social proof became increasingly important to me as I understood its power. Using these techniques to promote beneficial outcomes that served legitimate interests felt justified. But I saw how the same principles could be used to manipulate people into acting against their own welfare. The responsibility that comes with understanding group psychology is enormous. I also discovered the importance of timing in leveraging social proof. When people are already inclined toward a particular decision, evidence that others are making similar choices can provide the final push they need. But when people are strongly opposed to something, social proof alone rarely changes their minds and may even trigger reactionary responses. The most sophisticated application of social proof involves creating authentic momentum rather than artificial consensus. When you can generate genuine enthusiasm and support from credible individuals, that authentic energy becomes contagious and spreads naturally through social networks. This organic social proof is more sustainable and less likely to backfire than manufactured consensus. Understanding group psychology also taught me to recognize when I was being influenced by social proof myself. By maintaining awareness of how my own perceptions were shaped by what I believed others were thinking or doing, I could maintain more independent judgment during important decisions. The final lesson about social proof is that it works both ways. Just as people follow perceived consensus towards certain behaviors, they also avoid behaviors they believe are socially disapproved. Creating the impression that certain actions are widely rejected can be as powerful as promoting actions that are widely accepted. In modern contexts, these principles operate just as powerfully through digital media and professional networks. Understanding how people use social cues to guide their decisions can help you present ideas and proposals in ways that feel socially validated and psychologically comfortable for others to accept. During my years in diplomacy and politics, I discovered that human beings don't respond to facts, they respond to stories. The same information presented as dry statistics will be forgotten within hours, but when woven into a compelling narrative, it becomes memorable, emotionally engaging, and psychologically persuasive. Learning to craft and deploy stories strategically became one of my most powerful tools for influencing minds and outcomes. My understanding of narrative power began with observing how different messengers could deliver identical information and receive completely different responses. A military report stating casualty numbers would be received as data. But when a soldier described the same battle through his personal experience, the fear he felt, the courage he witnessed, the losses that mattered to him personally, suddenly, those numbers became real and urgent to the listeners. I realized that stories work because they bypass the analytical mind and speak directly to emotion and imagination. When people hear facts, they evaluate and question them. When they hear stories, they experience them. This experiential quality makes stories far more persuasive than logical arguments because people trust their emotions more than abstract reasoning. The first principle I learned about persuasive storytelling was the importance of relatability. The most powerful stories feature characters and situations that audiences can see themselves in. When I wanted to convince Florentine officials to support a particular policy, I wouldn't cite examples from distant kingdoms with different cultures and challenges. Instead, I would tell stories about similar Italian cities facing comparable situations. I discovered that the details you choose to include or omit dramatically shape how a story is interpreted. Every narrative can be told from multiple perspectives, emphasizing different aspects and leading to different conclusions. The same political alliance could be framed as a story of wise cooperation or dangerous dependence, depending on which details you highlighted and which you passed over quickly. During negotiations with French representatives, I learned to tell stories that positioned their objectives as heroic and noble, while making alternative approaches seem short-sighted or dishonorable. I didn't argue against their positions directly. Instead, I told stories that made them want to see themselves as the kind of people who would make the choices I preferred. The psychology behind this approach is profound. People want to be heroes in their own stories, and they will make decisions that align with heroic narratives rather than those that make them feel petty, fearful, or selfish. By framing situations in ways that allowed others to feel noble and wise for choosing what I wanted them to choose, I made my objectives psychologically attractive. I also discovered the power of hypothetical stories narratives about what might happen in various scenarios. These allowed me to explore consequences and possibilities without making direct predictions or threats. I could describe the potential outcomes of different choices through imaginative scenarios that felt less confrontational than explicit warnings or promises. For example, when trying to convince a city-state to avoid an alliance with our enemies, I wouldn't threaten them directly. Instead, I might tell a story about a hypothetical city that had made such an alliance and found itself caught between conflicting loyalties when tensions escalated. The story would illustrate the dangers without creating the defensiveness that direct warnings often provoke. I learned that stories about personal transformation are particularly powerful because they suggest that change is possible and desirable. When I wanted someone to reconsider their position or approach, I would share stories about individuals who had been in similar situations and found success by adopting different strategies. These narratives made change feel like growth rather than admission of error. The structure of persuasive stories follows predictable patterns that I studied and refined. The most effective narratives begin with a character facing a challenge or opportunity similar to the one confronting your audience. They show that character making choices and experiencing consequences, demonstrating the principles you want your audience to understand. They conclude with outcomes that illustrate the wisdom of the approach you're advocating. I discovered that the emotional arc of a story is often more important than its logical content. Stories that create tension and then provide relief, that generate sympathy and then offer hope, that establish problems and then reveal solutions. These emotional journeys engage people at a level deeper than conscious thought and create lasting impressions. One of my most effective techniques was embedding multiple messages within single stories. A narrative about military strategy might simultaneously communicate lessons about leadership, the importance of preparation, the value of adaptability, and the consequences of overconfidence. This layered approach allowed me to address several persuasion objectives simultaneously without seeming heavy-handed or manipulative. I also learned the importance of authentic detail in making stories believable and engaging. Generic narratives feel artificial and fail to capture imagination, but stories with specific details, particular places, exact conversations, precise descriptions of events feel real and trustworthy, even when they are hypothetical or heavily adapted from actual events. The timing of story deployment became crucial to its effectiveness. Stories told when people are receptive and attentive have far more impact than those shared when audiences are distracted or resistant. I learned to watch for moments when people were naturally open to new ideas, or when they had questions that stories could answer indirectly. I discovered that the most powerful stories often don't explicitly state their lessons. Instead, they allow listeners to draw their own conclusions, which creates a sense of personal discovery and ownership. When people feel they've learned something through their own insight rather than being taught directly, they become much more committed to applying that knowledge. The ethical responsibility of storytelling became increasingly important. I learned to manage the emotional environment surrounding important decisions by controlling information flow, setting appropriate expectations, and ensuring that key conversations occurred when people felt psychologically prepared for them. This often meant scheduling difficult discussions for times when stress levels were manageable and energy levels were adequate. Understanding timing also taught me when to withdraw pressure and allow natural psychological processes to work. Sometimes the most persuasive thing you can do is step back and let people reach conclusions at their own pace. Excessive eagerness or persistence can trigger resistance, even when your proposals are genuinely beneficial. The most sophisticated application of timing involves creating conditions where others naturally want to make decisions quickly rather than forcing urgency upon them. When people understand the benefits of acting promptly and feel confident in their choices, they create their own urgency and move forward with enthusiasm rather than reluctance. I also learned to recognize when timing was working against me and adjust accordingly. Sometimes postponing requests or proposals until circumstances improved would yield better results than persistence under unfavorable conditions. Patience and strategic delay often proved more effective than immediate action. The ethical foundation of timing-based influence requires ensuring that any urgency you create serves legitimate purposes and respects others' need for adequate consideration. Using time pressure to force decisions that people would reject given proper deliberation crosses the line from influence into manipulation. In modern contexts, these principles apply directly to professional negotiations, project management, and organizational change. Understanding how timing affects decision-making can help you present ideas when they're most likely to be received positively and implemented successfully. One of the most valuable lessons I learned in Renaissance politics was that direct confrontation with opposition almost always strengthens it. When you attack someone's position head-on, you trigger their defensive instincts and often transform mild disagreement into passionate resistance. The art of managing opposition lies not in overwhelming it, but in understanding its sources and redirecting its energy toward more constructive purposes. My education in handling resistance began with observing failed attempts by well-meaning officials to convince stubborn colleagues through argument and evidence. I watched as perfectly logical presentations generated increasing hostility rather than acceptance, as factual corrections created deeper entrenchment rather than changed minds. These experiences taught me that resistance often has psychological rather than logical roots. I learned to distinguish between different types of opposition and respond appropriately to each. Intellectual disagreement based on different interpretations of facts or values requires one approach. Emotional resistance based on fear, pride, or loyalty requires another. Personal animosity based on past conflicts or perceived slights requires yet another strategy entirely. The most common mistake I observed was treating all resistance as if it were intellectual disagreement. Well-meaning people would present more evidence, better arguments, or clearer explanations to opponents who weren't actually confused about the facts. These opponents understood the logical case perfectly well. They opposed it for emotional or psychological reasons that additional logic couldn't address. When facing emotional resistance, I learned to address the underlying feelings before attempting to discuss substantive issues. If someone opposed a proposal because it made them feel diminished or threatened, arguing about the proposal's merits only reinforced their sense of being attacked. Instead, I would first acknowledge their concerns and find ways to address their emotional needs. For example, when a senior official resisted a new administrative procedure because it seemed to reduce his authority, I didn't argue about efficiency or modernization. Instead, I framed the change as requiring his expertise to implement successfully, positioning him as essential to the initiative rather than threatened by it. Once his status concerns were addressed, he became an advocate for the very changes he had initially opposed. I discovered that people often resist ideas not because they disagree with them, but because accepting them would require admitting previous errors or changing established patterns. The psychological cost of acknowledging that their current approach isn't optimal can be more significant than any practical benefits from improvement. Understanding this dynamic allowed me to present changes in ways that preserved people's dignity and self-image. One powerful technique I developed was what I called progressive agreement. Instead of presenting complete proposals that people could reject entirely, I would begin with small points that were difficult to dispute, gradually building toward larger conclusions. Each small agreement created psychological momentum that made subsequent agreements easier to achieve. This approach worked because people want to be consistent with their previous statements and positions. Once someone had agreed that a problem existed, they felt pressure to accept logical solutions to that problem. Once they had acknowledged that certain principles were important, they found it difficult to oppose applications of those principles. I also learned the value of strategic concessions in managing opposition. When facing resistance to important objectives, I would sometimes offer to modify less crucial aspects of my proposals, allowing opponents to feel that their concerns had influenced the outcome. These concessions satisfied their need to have impact while protecting the essential elements I actually cared about. The psychology behind this approach is that people often resist primarily to assert their autonomy and influence. When they feel heard and see evidence that their input matters, they become much more cooperative about the substance of decisions. The appearance of compromise can eliminate resistance even when the core objectives remain unchanged. I discovered that some of the most effective ways to neutralize opposition involved redirecting it toward shared enemies or common challenges. People who might disagree about solutions often agreed about problems, and focusing their attention on external threats could transform them from opponents into reluctant allies. During territorial disputes between Italian city-states, I would sometimes emphasize the larger threat posed by foreign powers, reframing local conflicts as distractions from more serious challenges that required unity to address. This approach didn't eliminate the underlying disagreements, but it motivated temporary cooperation that could evolve into more lasting partnerships. Understanding the social dynamics of opposition also proved crucial. People often maintain resistant positions because changing them would affect their relationships with allies who share those positions. Isolated opponents can be persuaded through private conversations, but public resistance often requires face-saving mechanisms that allow people to change positions without appearing to abandon their supporters. I learned to provide these face opportunities by introducing new information or changed circumstances that justified position shifts. When someone could say, given these new developments, I now believe, rather than I was wrong before, they could change course without damaging their reputation or relationships. The most sophisticated approach to managing opposition involved converting opponents into advocates by giving them ownership of solutions. When people felt they had contributed to developing an approach, they became invested in its success, rather than motivated to prove its failure. This required patience and genuine openness to input, but it transformed resistance into commitment. I also discovered the importance of timing in addressing opposition. Attempting to overcome resistance when emotions were high or stakes felt urgent usually failed, but allowing time for initial reactions to moderate, providing opportunities for private reflection, and returning to discussions when people felt less defensive often yielded dramatically different results. The ethical foundation for managing opposition requires respecting opponents' legitimate interests and concerns. The goal should be finding solutions that address real needs, rather than simply overcoming resistance for its own sake. When opposition is based on valid concerns, those concerns deserve genuine consideration rather than psychological manipulation. The final lesson about opposition is that some resistance serves valuable purposes by forcing you to strengthen your ideas, consider alternative perspectives, and build broader support. Effective leaders don't eliminate all opposition, they channel it constructively to improve outcomes while maintaining relationships and organizational health. Destroys both the wielder and those around him. My ethical framework began with a simple principle: influence should serve legitimate interests and create mutual benefit rather than advancing selfish objectives at others' expense. This doesn't mean that every interaction must benefit all parties equally, but it does mean that the long-term consequences of your influence should make the world better rather than worse. The first crucial distinction I learned was between persuasion and manipulation. Persuasion involves helping people understand information and perspectives that allow them to make better decisions for themselves. Manipulation involves distorting their understanding or exploiting their psychological vulnerabilities to make them act against their own best interests. During my diplomatic career, I often used persuasive techniques to help negotiating partners see how agreements could serve their nation's long-term interests, even when those agreements also served Florence's objectives. This was ethical persuasion because the outcomes genuinely benefited everyone involved. However, if I had used the same techniques to convince them to accept terms that would ultimately harm their people, that would have crossed into manipulation. I discovered that the key ethical test is whether you would be comfortable with your influence techniques being used on you by someone with similar objectives. If you're trying to convince someone to make a decision that you would want to make in their situation, your influence is probably ethical. If you're trying to convince them to do something you would resist if your roles were reversed, you're probably manipulating rather than persuading. The question of consent became central to my ethical thinking about influence. Adults have the right to make their own decisions, even poor ones, based on accurate information and genuine understanding of their options. Ethical influence respects this autonomy by providing better information and clearer thinking rather than bypassing rational decision-making entirely. I learned to distinguish between influencing what people think about and influencing how they think, helping someone focus their attention on relevant considerations, understand important implications, or consider alternative perspectives enhances their decision-making capacity, but undermining their ability to think clearly, creating false urgency that prevents adequate consideration, or exploiting emotional vulnerabilities crosses ethical boundaries. The vulnerability of the person being influenced also affects the ethical calculus significantly. Using sophisticated psychological techniques on children, elderly individuals with diminished capacity, or people in crisis situations requires much higher standards of care than influencing competent adults in normal circumstances. Greater vulnerability demands greater protection rather than greater exploitation. I developed a personal code that included several specific prohibitions. I would never use influence techniques to convince people to harm themselves or their families. I would never exploit psychological vulnerabilities created by grief, fear, or desperation. I would never use deception about matters that people had a right to understand clearly, and I would never use my understanding of psychology to gain advantages in situations where fairness and honest dealing were expected. The long-term consequences of influence also matter enormously for ethical evaluation. Some techniques might seem harmless in individual applications, but become destructive when used systematically or widely adopted. If everyone used certain influence tactics, would society become better or worse? Would trust increase or decrease? Would human relationships become more authentic or more artificial? I learned that transparency about your objectives often serves as an ethical safeguard. When people understand what you're trying to achieve and why, they can evaluate your influence attempts appropriately and maintain their autonomy. Hidden agendas and concealed motivations are often signs that influence has crossed into manipulation. The relationship between the influencer and the influenced also affects ethical considerations. Using psychological techniques on enemies during wartime operates under different ethical rules than using them on friends during peacetime. Professional relationships have different standards than personal ones. The context and expectations of the relationship determine what kinds of influence are appropriate. I discovered that the most ethical influence often involves teaching others to think more clearly rather than directing their conclusions. When you help people understand their own values, clarify their objectives, and consider consequences more thoroughly, you enhance their autonomy rather than undermining it. This type of influence makes people more capable of making good decisions independently. The means used to gather information for influence also raise ethical questions. Observing public behavior and listening to voluntary statements is different from spying on private conversations or manipulating people into revealing information they intended to keep confidential. Respecting others' privacy and dignity must be part of any ethical approach to influence. I learned that sustainable influence requires maintaining your own integrity and the trust of others over time. Techniques that achieve short-term objectives by damaging your reputation or relationships ultimately undermine your ability to create positive influence in the future. The most effective long-term strategy is also the most ethical one. Self-awareness became crucial for maintaining ethical boundaries. It's easy to rationalize questionable influence attempts by convincing yourself that your objectives are noble, or that the people you're influencing deserve whatever treatment you give them. Regular, honest self-examination about your motivations and methods helps prevent this ethical drift. The final principle I developed was reciprocity in ethics. I would only use influence techniques that I would be willing to have used on myself by someone with legitimate objectives. This standard helped me distinguish between tools that enhance human communication and cooperation versus those that exploit psychological weaknesses for selfish gain. Understanding psychology and influence carries the responsibility to use that understanding wisely. These tools can help create better outcomes for everyone involved, but only when they're guided by genuine concern for others' welfare and respect for human dignity and autonomy. In modern contexts, these ethical considerations become even more important as psychological influence techniques become more sophisticated and widely understood. The challenge is using this knowledge to improve human relationships and social outcomes, while maintaining the trust and authenticity that makes civilized society possible. As I reflect on the principles of human psychology I discovered in Renaissance Italy, I'm struck by how little the fundamental nature of human beings has changed despite the dramatic transformation of their circumstances. The same psychological drives, emotional needs, and decision-making patterns that shaped behavior in my era continue to operate in your modern world, though they now express themselves through different technologies and social structures. The need for respect and recognition that motivated Italian nobles continues to drive behavior in modern offices and organizations. People still want to feel valued, competent, and important. They still make decisions based on emotion and justify them with logic. They still follow perceived authority, seek social proof for their choices, and respond to the psychological principles of reciprocity, scarcity, and consistency. What has changed is the speed and scale at which these psychological dynamics operate. In my time, influence networks developed over months and years through personal relationships and face-to-face interactions. Today, the same psychological principles work through digital communications that can reach thousands of people instantly and create viral effects that spread influence far beyond direct relationships. The principle of authority, for example, now operates through online credentials, social media followers, and digital endorsements as much as through traditional titles and positions. Someone with a verified social media account, prestigious educational background listed in their profile, or large number of followers receives automatic deference, similar to what titled nobles enjoyed in my era. Social proof has become dramatically more powerful and accessible through digital platforms. where I had to carefully observe and reference the opinions of respected third parties. Modern influencers can display real-time evidence of how many people support their ideas through likes, shares, comments, and reviews. This immediate feedback creates powerful psychological pressure that can influence behavior much more quickly than traditional social proof. The psychology of reciprocity now operates through digital interactions, where small acts of helpfulness, sharing useful information, making valuable introductions, or providing helpful feedback can create networks of mutual obligation that span geographical boundaries. The same principle that worked in Florentine politics now functions through professional networking platforms and online communities. Storytelling has been transformed by multimedia capabilities that allow modern communicators to create much more engaging and emotionally compelling narratives than were possible with words alone. Visual elements, audio components, and interactive features can create experiential stories that influence audiences more powerfully than traditional oral or written narratives. The challenge of reading unspoken communication has become more complex in an era where much interaction happens through text-based digital communications. The micro-expressions and body language cues I relied upon are often unavailable, requiring new skills in interpreting written tone, response timing, and digital behavior patterns to understand others' true feelings and intentions. However, video, conferencing, and social media provide new opportunities for psychological observation. People often reveal authentic emotions and reactions during virtual meetings, and their social media activity patterns can provide insights into their values, interests, and psychological states that might not be apparent in formal professional interactions. The principles of timing and psychological pressure have accelerated dramatically in digital environments where people expect immediate responses and rapid decisions. The same scarcity psychology that I used with limited military alliances now operates through flash sales, limited time offers, and trending topics that create urgency through artificial time constraints. Modern professionals face challenges that parallel those I encountered in Renaissance diplomacy: building influence without formal authority, managing resistance to change, creating win-win outcomes in competitive environments, and maintaining ethical standards while achieving practical objectives. These remain central challenges that can be addressed using psychological principles I developed centuries ago. The group psychology I observed in Renaissance crowds now operates through online communities, social media movements, and digital echo chambers where people seek social proof and conform to perceived group norms. Understanding these dynamics has become essential for anyone seeking to influence organizational culture or social change. The long-term influence building that required years of careful relationship cultivation in my era can now be accelerated through digital platforms that allow consistent value creation and relationship maintenance across larger networks. However, the fundamental requirement for genuine value creation and authentic relationship building remains unchanged. Modern applications of psychological influence must also account for increased awareness of manipulation techniques among educated populations. People today are more likely to recognize and resist obvious influence attempts, requiring more subtle and authentic approaches that respect their intelligence and autonomy. The ethical considerations I grappled with have become more complex. In an era where psychological influence can be scaled and automated through technology, the same techniques that might be ethical when used individually in personal relationships could become problematic when deployed systematically across large populations through digital platforms. The transparency that digital communications enable also creates new opportunities for ethical influence. Modern practitioners can more easily share their objectives, provide evidence for their claims, and allow others to verify information independently. This transparency can enhance trust and make influence more authentic and beneficial. The democratization of influence tools through digital technology means that psychological principles once available only to political elites are now accessible to anyone with internet access. This creates both opportunities for positive change and risks of widespread manipulation that must be addressed through education and ethical frameworks. The speed of modern communications also requires faster decision-making about when and how to apply psychological influence. The deliberate, patient approach that served me well in Renaissance diplomacy must be adapted to environments where opportunities appear and disappear rapidly. Despite these changes, the fundamental insight remains the same: understanding human psychology and applying that understanding ethically and skillfully can dramatically improve your ability to create positive outcomes in any situation involving human cooperation. Whether you're leading a team, building a business, or working towards social change, the principles that guided successful influence in Renaissance Italy can guide successful influence today. The key is adapting timeless psychological insights to contemporary contexts while maintaining the ethical standards and authentic relationship focus that make influence sustainable and beneficial for everyone involved. The tools have evolved, but the human nature they work with remains remarkably consistent across centuries. After sharing with you the psychological principles I discovered through decades of observation and practice in Renaissance Italy, I want to leave you. Practice the art of reframing by taking positions or proposals that initially seem unattractive and finding ways to present them that address others' core concerns and values. This doesn't mean being dishonest, but rather finding authentic angles that make beneficial outcomes more psychologically appealing to the people whose cooperation you need. Develop your storytelling abilities by collecting examples and anecdotes that illustrate important principles you want to communicate. Practice presenting these stories in ways that allow listeners to draw their own conclusions, rather than having lessons imposed upon them. This indirect teaching method creates much stronger conviction and commitment than direct instruction. Begin tracking your influence attempts and their outcomes to identify which approaches work best with different types of people in various situations. Keep simple notes about what techniques you tried, how people responded, and what you might do differently next time. This systematic approach accelerates your learning and helps you refine your methods. Study the timing of your requests and proposals by paying attention to when people seem most receptive to new ideas. Notice patterns in their energy levels, stress cycles, and decision-making patterns that might inform when to introduce important topics versus when to wait for better moments. Practice managing your own emotional state during challenging interactions. When others become defensive, aggressive, or unreasonable, work on maintaining calm composure that models the behavior you want to see. Your emotional regulation often influences others' emotional states more than their own conscious efforts. Experiment with different types of authority signals appropriate to your situation and role. This might include how you dress, where you position yourself in meetings, how you use your voice, or how you structure your credentials and expertise in introductory contexts. Find ways to project competence and reliability without appearing arrogant or artificial. Begin building long-term influence networks by identifying people whose careers and influence are likely to grow over time. Invest in these relationships early by providing value, showing genuine interest in their success, and maintaining contact even when you don't need immediate assistance from them. Develop ethical boundaries for your influence activities by regularly examining your motivations and methods. Ask yourself whether your influence attempts serve legitimate purposes, respect others' autonomy, and create mutual benefit rather than one-sided advantage. These ethical guardrails prevent your skills from being used destructively. Practice patience in your influence efforts by recognizing that sustainable change often takes time. Instead of pushing for immediate compliance, focus on gradual shifts in understanding and relationship building that create foundation for lasting cooperation and support. Finally, remember that mastery of psychological influence is ultimately about serving others more effectively rather than manipulating them for selfish gain. When you understand human nature deeply and use that understanding to create better outcomes for everyone involved, you honor the noble potential of these powerful capabilities. The skills I've shared with you took me decades to develop through trial and error in some of history's most challenging political environments. You have the advantage of learning these principles directly rather than discovering them through painful experience. Use this advantage wisely, and you'll find that understanding human psychology dramatically enhances your ability to create positive change in whatever domain of life you choose to focus your efforts. Begin today. Start small. Practice consistently. And remember that every interaction is an opportunity to understand human nature more deeply and apply that understanding more skillfully. The investment you make in developing these capabilities will serve you and those around you for the rest of your life.